fun.
Great. Okay, so this is, I think we're midway through the 2020 semester season of the Data Together Reading a Group, and the topic this week was trust, both cryptographic and human. I didn't realize that piece until I read it again today, that we had that like subtitle to it. And yeah, so Brendan and I will be, I guess, facilitating it. I guess maybe I thought we could start off, if it's okay, with like just a go around about what people thought. We had like a bunch of readings, but they were quite brief. So I thought we might just start with like general impressions around the topic, and then kind of maybe try and move through the core ones and see where people are at. Yeah, so does anyone want to go first about kind of like what came up for them when they were reading this stuff?
I don't have a whole lot to say, but my immediate impression was that .everyone piece talking about how people work with technology and whether it's accessible and whether they feel like they have power over it. I want to read that whole paper. That was really, really cool. It really brought home a lot of the concepts that we talked about in the Monopolies reading of like, there was a quote in there that was along the lines of, well, it doesn't really matter if I understand the issue. My option is to turn it on or off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I didn't get much chance to read. I was like skimmed everything, and I realized I really wanted to read. I really wanted to read that the Brunton one, because it's like story based, and I haven't been able. It's like the longest one, so I didn't get to get through it. But I guess the thing, I mean, the thing that I was, from what I skimmed when like the Wikipedia page, and there's like a TechCrunch article. I guess I'm more interested in the human aspect of trust and the cryptographic part generally. And I didn't see that much yet in the readings, or what I could read at the time. So, yeah.
I'll chime in, I guess, because it's maybe you can do some connecting work there. Yeah, because I definitely, some of the initial basis for this talk came out of this sort of relationship between cryptographic trust and human trust. And specifically, one of the things we were trying to get at was a little bit of the co-opting of the phrase trust, or the repurposing of the phrase trust, as it relates to, and looking at it through both sides of the mirror, or however many sides of the prism, or choose your object. But I think the thing that for me really jumped out was that, like, Kelsey, is really with you on the .everyone. Just this, from one side, you're just seeing this like population that just feels completely beholden to like sort of at the whims of a technology, and like a degraded faith and a sense of a lack of control being expressed in a number of places. And then at the other side, you also have the TechCrunch article sort of talking about how, oh yes, we're going to rebuild the trust web. And they're describing something that is at the same time more complicated and like less and less about trust in the human sense, right? I think that was what was exciting about the .everything in juxtaposition to the cryptographic concept of trust, where for me, what really jumped out is like, if you read the Bitcoin white paper, that first paragraph, it sort of talks about how, oh, we're going to solve the trust problem. But it's a fairly narrow definition, right? It's the double spending problem is really what they're talking about. And the double spending problem is just being able to prove that a single dollar was only spent once, or once at a time. And how that quickly sort of like spirals into a lexicon that sort of co-opts the phrase trust, or leverages the phrase trust, which I found really, yeah, it's just like that. I really wanted to talk about that today. I wanted to see what others think about the way that the word trust is used and reused, and what it means to different people in this space. Mm-hmm. I guess that was more questions than observations, but sort of where my head's at.
Yeah, I'll raise some, I'll build on that, and then maybe that'll help us kind of like go into a direction for discussion. I totally kind of echo Brendan, those themes you brought up and what everyone else has mentioned is sort of being on my mind, and also when we were thinking about selecting this. I think the other thing that we were trying to kind of complement, and I think it'd be fun to talk about even if folks didn't get to read it, is like a little bit of that history that came out of Finn Brunton's like book Digital Cash, about like actually some of the things that were going on to like help redefine trust as it got redefined in this like cryptographic way, and then taken up by the sort of like decentralistas. And I think that other piece of Libra, which maybe makes sense to kind of bring up at the end, was us like trying to think about this role of like gatekeepers, or like who those trusted parties are. And I mean, this sort of skewed pretty financial heavy in terms of like, you know, like there's like the Bitcoin white paper. Libra Association is also in this like very financialized like technology, like take the social web, here comes the trust web. I think even though it's sort of broadly trying to be about something else, really falls into that like talking about trust in a very specific technology way that's very informed by like cryptocurrency. But then we wanted to like open that up a little bit and sort of, or like do that comparison work or think about the ways that that term is being leveraged in those contexts. And that's why we chose that .everyone summary, because I think it does a nice like, hey, like, what are people currently thinking about their relationship to technology? And then also, I don't know if it's helpful, but it was helpful to just like spend a bit of time looking at that Wikipedia article and being like, oh, right, like what are all of the different contexts that trust is used in? And a lot of them are like not about financial transactions. So why is this the like dominant like source to mine for inspiration when we talk about technology? There's a very specific kind of like lineage there. Yeah, anyway, I see a hand. Go, Kelsey.
Yeah, and it's impossible to not remember in this moment that Edgy got into the decentralized web because of a lack of trust in the state. And like, I'm reading these articles while like at a protest where we're facing off against militarized police, and on the other side of the barricade, that the one barricade the police have erected is between them and the peaceful protesters. And meanwhile, like 2 days ago, someone, you know, drove from the street into the crowd, and every other protest I've ever been at, there's been a barricade erected by the police to protect protesters from traffic, right? Like, there's no trust here. And like yesterday, a big event in the Seattle protest is that the face-off, they actually left. And so we took the precinct, they had boarded it up and like all sort of stuff, but the street that had been blocked for over a week was now available. And like, it's really this interesting space where everyone's talking about like, well, who do we trust? Like, the police are obviously not allowed in this space. There are still barricades up controlling access. Those barricades are, it's really, there's no one leader here. The barricades are controlled by different people who are like, just showing up, honestly. It could be anyone. The John Brown Gun Club, which is a far left Second Amendment group, has shown up to do security against threats of Proud Boys. That's been a rumor around for like days. There's like, and everything inside the zone it feels very Burning Man, to be honest. There's just incredible amounts of just free stuff, and people walking by several times an hour offering you food and earplugs and hand sanitizers and stuff. And so there's this really strong outpouring of community trust in this moment, especially over trust of state, trust of sanctioned authority. But there's not a real strong trust in like decentralization as a concept. And it's really hard to believe that that we've reached like some kind of sustainable state. So there is still need for something. And it feels like we want tech to be the answer, like in the general space, not here specifically, that lets us have both.
Can I ask you to say a little more about this one last part you said? I think you gave us a lot to kind of connect back to the readings, but this idea of like, there's not trust in decentralization as a concept. Like, what do you mean? Do you mean like people aren't using the term decentralization to think about that space. I mean, I've seen people on Twitter referring to it as a TAZ, like an autonomous zone. And it's very much drawing on like a set of anarchist literature and, you know, organizing tactics, but I'm very much at a distance.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's crazy because even when you're standing there, you're still getting most of your information from the Twitter hashtag, which is part of the issue. There are people present who absolutely do trust like these anarchy principles. That's definitely a thing that's happening. But broadly, as a society and even as a group of protesters, there is not like a consensus of trust. More co-opted keywords, consensus. But I don't know, does that help?
I have like so many places that we could go from there in my mind. I guess I wonder, I think you kind of bring up what is, maybe we could unpack this a little more before we kind of like go in a little bit to that, like, I would say maybe the Finn Brunton reading and the Satoshi Nakamoto, like that first Bitcoin paper. But like this idea of like, I think this comes up so much in all of our previous reading groups, is the like wanting to use the tech or like what that needs to look like. I mean, maybe we could talk more about how we've experienced people wanting to rely on tech for trust, or like what forms those currently look like. Because I mean, I would say that the way that decentralization wants, or certain decentralized protocols want to replace trust or be trustless, is only one thread in that. I think even in Silicon Valley, there's like a new mode that we want to use new forms of like technical mediation to like replace or augment how you think about a relationship you have with a trusted party. Like any reputation system that anyone decides to implement where you vote on people, you know, is like an example. But maybe we could just like talk a little bit about like that, how tech is being mixed up with trust relationships first. That might help us like kind of set the stage.
I guess my little input on this is that I think in terms of the social perspective on trust, it's based on vulnerability and based on whether you feel comfortable being vulnerable with somebody, whereas technological or tech-based trust isn't actually based on vulnerability. It's based on like invulnerability. So you're not actually trusting. It's more that you feel comfortable that nothing's actually going to happen just because of the way that the technology is structured. So I just feel like in terms of the experience, it's very different. So I mean, I don't know. I guess obviously trust plays a role, but I think like conceptualizing it as trust is like the opposite of what it actually is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think for me, when I was reading through some of the readings, I got through the that .everyone paper, and just thinking about like how like edgy, like how I built trust and relationships with people with edgy, like because we, you know, it was mediated through Slack and like Zoom, and, like through technological processes, and the only way for me, I felt like the way that I built trust with folks here was through reliability, like people showing up for each other on a, you know, weekly basis. Like we were always showing up for each other and we depended on each other. And I don't see, yeah, trust is earned, exactly. And I don't see how like any form of technology like creates that like reliability where I'm like, where I can actually say like, I trust Kelsey, I trust Don, I trust Brendan, you know.
Yeah, I think like the way that I conceptualize trust from a social perspective or an interpersonal perspective is like, it's like a feedback loop, because if you give a little bit of vulnerability to someone, then they will kind of return that, and then gradually more trust is built. But then there's also like a negative feedback loop too, where if you let somebody know that you mistrust them, then they will be more guarded around you and they'll mistrust you. So over time, there will be more and more mistrust. So it's like a process, but in terms of like technological trust, it's like a first principles sort of approach where it's not about the process, but it's about like the rules or the structure.
Yeah, sorry, hopefully I can jump in if others are okay with that. Because yeah, I think that's really interesting and like a very important, I love, Masha, that you honed in on this, on the vulnerability characteristic, on this sort of like, and the sort of, I think I'd like to sort of highlight that is the sort of way that a relationship, a real relationship of trust starts with no protocol and evolves over time, right? Like it's, and as you're sort of referring to this cycle of like, okay, I'm going to give you a little, I'm going to lead with a little bit of vulnerability in an effort to sort of like move things forward. But from the other perspective, you also have like, from the protocol design perspective, or from like a cryptocurrency, a much more constrained definition of trust that sort of has to arrest every possible interaction that could happen and codify it, and sort of, and we use the phrase trustlessness, right? And this like assuming bad actors sort of methodology. And I think for me, I like Kelsey, have been spending a lot of time thinking about the police, and a lot of time thinking about particularly following very closely to Minnesota's defunding sort of promise that has come out, and this sort of like stepping forward, which is a very human capacity to say, look, we don't understand what we're going to do, but we know that this isn't working, and we've at least had some public commitment on the behalf of politicians to sort of like work on a new thing, right? On moving a way forward. And I think that that's an interesting, like how on earth would that, like, it's just such an interesting display of trust. I think one could very much argue that, you know, the phrasing that we use for decentralization really sort of starts to fall apart here, where like there has been a sort of transition of power by virtue of sort of productive or protests that have managed to sort of produce, start to achieve the outcomes that they desire. But like, I don't know that we would, if we were to call that decentralization, that sounds like shoehorning things in a way that doesn't feel right. And so I think there's like an interesting way in which, to me, that's like a lot of what's been happening in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the protests that we're seeing across the world right now, just like don't in any way graph onto this, into this sort of crypto digital current. Like, it's amazing how stale some of these articles feel in the current context, and how incredible, like all of this fundamentally is about a lack of trust in the police, right? Like a lack of, like, we don't, like, this is a trust conversation. It's just not the one that we picked the readings for in some ways, and in other ways it really is. But I don't know, I just think that's really interesting, and I just want to highlight the sort of the limit of the framing here, and how much the current sort of events has kind of really blown that open. That was a bit of a ramble, but
no, totally makes sense. I mean, I would just add, like, I think we've had these sort of like success in previous readings, really trying to like bring up against like pretty disparate things around each other. Like, I remember we were talking about like the relationship to the state and the civic, and we like had that no one is illegal reading, and you know, like, I think that has always been really helpful to kind of like open up things. And in this case, we actually have a much tighter set of readings that are about like a very narrow take on like a technological take on trust, but that, like, yeah, I think current events and, you know, witnessing state violence, police brutality, you know, the murder of George Floyd, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and her death here in Toronto has like really like, yeah, it's just like it's kind of showing the paucity of some of this to explain like what I would say is more at stake in most people's relationship to tech. But I do want to say that, I don't know if you've noticed, but there are absolutely some Bitcoin people on Twitter who have tried to make a case for cryptographic protocols in this moment. I'm not even joking. I wish I was joking. They are like wild ride Twitter thread reads. Like, you're like, I don't even know where you're going with this. They involve like hand-drawn charts. They're about the financial system. And then at the end, they're like, oh, and this is why it will solve police brutality. And you're like, what? Like, this is ideology. This is pure ideology at this point. Like, you can't even like drop your thing for a moment and like actually like engage separate from that with like what's going on. Sorry, I saw a couple of those yesterday, and like I'm still thinking about them. Okay, so that as an aside. I actually thought something that you said, and that builds on what Masha said, would be the thread that would be more meaningful to carry forward, was this idea of like first principle structure over process. And Brennan, you said this idea of like a real relationship of trust starts with no protocol and evolves over time. I think both of what you said opens up some really interesting possibilities. And this is not to agree or disagree, it's just to offer more to that conversation. I absolutely think there's something about how stuff evolves, or like the process side, that is very under considered in how, like say a design gets like spec'd out or implemented, and like the format of a white paper is like this, like, oh, I've made an argument that will like hold up over time as like the final instantiation of like this thing, this proof of concept that maybe has like an intellectual lineage that sets itself up to be bad like that. But that actually, I think that protocol in different contexts, and say in like, you know, in Indigenous communities, in the way that some labs that are like Indigenous STS labs have drawn on protocol, like I think allows for an evolution, or actually allows for a structure that builds trust. So I kind of feel like there maybe are models to think about like what a scaffold is that like provides that space that you can like build relationships in, that's different than this weird like rigid, like, oh, we made a protocol that's like not flexible and like didn't consider a full range of things, and now everyone has to operate in the narrow confines. I think I saw a hand from Kelsey.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, Masha, that you brought in, there were a bunch of frameworks, and I'm like spinning them all around in my head, so this may not come out super coherent. I especially really liked the truth default theory concept, where it's saying that people by default think that other people are telling the truth. And I feel like there is a really interesting place where the protocol aspects plug in. Like Masha, you talked about positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops for trust, but I'm not sure, like, I think there's got to be nuances in there that are kind of the problem. Like, and I'm, yeah, I not like to pick it up or anything, but like trust, specifically you called out vulnerability, and I think that that's really, really accurate. But I think that we often take following of protocol as a proxy for being of actual goodwill, I guess. And then we have this problem of like I guess a classic abusive relationship of any kind, whether it's like state with people or, you know, person with person, is where that negative cycle doesn't kick in, right? So it's where you keep trusting them even though they never, or they rarely, or they often betray your trust. So like that's kind of a failure of our trust mechanisms. And then there's sort of this part where protocol comes in, and I've kind of been formulating phraseologies that I haven't thought all the way out in the chat of like, well, what if protocols are guidelines for how you can earn trust in a specific community? Because it absolutely is part of what goes on in terms of like, if you dress a certain way, if you know how to act at a certain kind of dinner, the community that cares about how you act at that certain kind of dinner can use that as a proxy for you being of the community, trustable by the community. But then when you have different protocols, I mean, this is conflation, pure conflation here. But you know, if you have UDP try to talk to HTTP, like you're just not going to have a success at all. There's nothing there. So I'll stop now.
I think there's something interesting though about, there's something about that site of like protocol and the way that that word is used in different areas. I think that does open up something, like, again, this idea of in kind of like a narrow technical sense, or how it's used, I think maybe in particular around like a current wave of decentralized projects is very different than even I think that broader history of protocols in computing and digital communications, to be honest, because most of them are old and grow and like weird, and over time, and the history of how they get defined and redefined is quite interesting and intense. Not totally my area. I made a BGP joke, not very well, but we know some people who are really into BGP who are like data together friends. I wonder actually if maybe this does help us segue a little bit into talking about that kind of like cryptographic trust, and maybe that we can rely on Brunton, but we don't have to exclusively to kind of like think about that. I think he just provides a couple of anecdotes and like moments from this early history of when it was getting developed that are helpful to kind of understand some of the intellectual underpinnings, or like what was motivating those folks, which I think definitely like inflect how those concepts get used in the technologies that are built with them.
I want to sort of connect what Kelsey said with, I watched the video of last month's talk, and somebody brought up the idea of the blockchain intersecting with medical data. And like,
my bad.
So like, I think Kelsey brought up like this idea of like of the switch of when you switch into like the negative feedback loop or the distrust cycle, and like it kind of conflicts with the sort of ledger aspect of blockchain, and how like if somebody abuses the trust in that type of system, the information that, like if information is supposed to be private and it becomes public as a result of an abuse of trust, then there's limited recourse in terms of what you can do to, well, I mean, you can't undo it, but then also you can't, I guess like, how would a negative feedback loop work in that kind of a context is what I'm asking.
Totally, like, go ahead, sorry.
No, great. I was gonna say maybe Brendan can respond.
Yeah, totally. I think it's interesting. Like it's not. This is another misappropriation of a phrase, but the notion of being like sort of outed when you're using a permanent append-only log is, and by outed I don't mean in the sort of like sort of the closet sense. I mean in the like de-anonymization sense, right? If we're and when we sort of start intermingling, I think you can abstract past medical data and really any kind of person identifiable information, right? Even your transaction history itself forms a sort of unique behavioral pattern, and like Bitcoin has struggled with this for a long time. It's never claimed to be anonymous, but it's sort of like implied it. And I think that I don't think that means that a blockchain is sort of it's a data structure at the end of the day, and so you have mechanisms for, you can control for that to some degree by moving things off of the chain that don't need to be on it. And really sort of, and I think we see a lot of stuff like in Zcash, which is like a really great example of trying to take anonymization to the nth degree in a blockchain, and really, and have those two sort of ideas sit in the same space at the same time and be relatively cohesive. But I think that I guess there's it intersects with this, like, do I trust the technology, and then what types of trust does the technology enable? I think are the two questions that jump to mind for me. And the reason I brought it up in the last call was, I think that contact tracing and blockchain adjacent technologies have some merit, right? Where you really, one of the things that if you wave a magic wand and sort of assume that the Zcash approach works and you can have a sufficiently anonymous blockchain, does it help you create a situation where, because you don't have the central authority sort of governing a ledger, are you able to sort of prevent the NSA problem, when it comes to sort of like managing a contact tracing framework. Because I think that when we look at our own health data, and I think it's really what it is at the end of the day is a collection of individually owned things is the way I sort of perceive it, like which is your own health information, right? Like everybody sort of has their own health record, but there's a collective interest in us being able to trust each other and share important moments of intersection, right? The classic, like you and I have been in the same space, and no classic, wow, talking like things that are 3 months old or life. But you know, you and I have been in the same space, and we both sort of would like to sort of like have some sort of zero knowledge method of exchanging that information. I think the Libra paper really sort of speaks to like the antithesis of this, where you sort of like have a blockchain for the sake of just saying the word blockchain. And I really, that's part of the reason I wanted to assign some of the super dry reading for this of the Libra thing, because like I thought it was really important to look at like, oh, Libra Networks is a company and Libra Association there's a Libra board that is inside of the Libra company and they govern the network and the blah, 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 blah. And you're supposed to just sort of look at all this and say, yes, we can trust this. And I think that that's this like very interesting intersection there. And the reason I bring it up in answer to the question about healthcare data and blockchains is like governance, right? And protocol and process, where we have this, the section on governance of a lot of these projects is really where I think we have a lot of questions of is this really centralization? Is that a lot of sort of like questions of history sort of show up there. Wow, that's a bit of rambling. How do I sort of make this into something cohesive?
If it's okay, I would actually say maybe we could start. There's a couple of really succinct but kind of like opinionated takes that Finn Brunton has in the section, the last section I recommended, which might be like cool to respond to, which kind of will like get us into thinking about both those sort of three readings. If that feels okay, if there's more, maybe Mash, that you want to directly respond to and what Brendan said, like I will leave it to you. But otherwise, I thought I could give us a couple quotes. Okay, cool. So I think I said that we had a short section in chapter 10, which is like kind of the synthesis of, I think, Finn Brunton's argument, and then sort of like that background in cryptography in chapter 3. So the parts that I wanted to surface from chapter 10 are like his analysis of like, I guess, Bitcoin, which I think is like compelling in an interesting way. So his argument is, this is like on page 155, Bitcoin is an incremental technology. So the actual technological advance is small, but it had a striking theoretical breakthrough. So it combined a lot of work that came out of cryptography and computation from peer-to-peer networking, and also like ways that they dealt with digital timestamps. That kind of like connected it to this like larger history of like digital cash schemes, which very much came out of like a libertarian background. And then he has I've just lost it. I have like my notes are way too long for this, so it's hard to find them all. Oh, here. Okay. So the coin in Bitcoin, this is on page 161 from Nakamoto. The direct quote from that paper is like, Bitcoin is an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. And then I think this is a Brunton quote. It's a system for collective verification of ownership with no existence outside the system of verification. So it's kind of like both a structure, a technical structure, and then an ownership convention is part of what Finn Brunton, like what Brunton wants to make very clear. And to that point that Brendan said about anonymity, so there's this notion of like an anonymous sort of, but it's like using money that's unconditionally visible, traceable, and public always. So what anonymity means there, it's like fallen down over the years in terms of how people use it, or can like review those like public transactions. This is where I think there's this sort of two more really interesting arguments he makes. So how he sees that there is a form of trustworthiness operating in the system, sort of different than trust on a third party. Again, like, so Bitcoin was really responding to a very narrow take on like a type of trust before that was like in financial context, which is on page 68. The process of policing transactions and preventing double spending, and thereby the perception of trustworthiness, confidence, and value of currency in the eyes of its holders, required turning the physics of computation into a kind of friction or a break. So a deliberate inefficiency in a system as a replacement for a trusted third party. And how that was done in Bitcoin is through hash collisions. So it's a trust in scarcity rather than a trust in the value of a currency that would rely on others. Like what the system has set out to do is prove to you how difficult it is to make more of it, and that it's verifiable that this amount was that amount of difficulty to make. And so I think his sort of like concluding take is that this whole apparatus, the apparency of the ledger, the verification of ownership, the proof of work process, and foreknowledge of the introduction of the remaining quantity of new money are actually designed to produce a predictable amount of scarcity that you would call verifiable, distributed, and trustless. But it's actually putting this as like a scarce object into a specific infrastructure. So it's like the ledger of the blockchain and how it works. And it's sort of like this, I mean, one that is like kind of relies on, as I think folks have seen in like the development of the actual technology, like new types of trust or ways to like relate a set of people to each other. So it's sort of interesting that it's like a trustless system, but it's a system that has a community, and like maybe you could not say good things about its governance, but has a governance around like the underlying production of that system. So maybe that was like a little heavy. I'm realizing too that I always read things that are like academic, and I'm like, it's like in my brain. So I think I sometimes say things really densely. But I thought that that was such a great, like it's an opinionated take on Bitcoin, but I think it's very interesting about like what trust was removed and then like what a new form or infrastructure that it created. I think Caleb agrees.
Yes, sorry, I'm glad to hear you can hear that. We're having dinner now. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that that really is such an interesting, it's the beauty of the Bitcoin paper and the beauty of the history of this. I think that it's really interesting that this came out of sort of libertarian groups and the sort of bringing up of this sort of origins of this thinking. And I think that, and the contextualization as an incremental technology, I think is quite interesting, right? Because it's often heralded as this revolutionary concept. And then at the same time, if you connect that to the like the trust web article from TechCrunch, it's like, no, you know, digital currencies are infrastructure. Like they're a thing that you can use to get to smart contracts, which we didn't really talk about a ton, but I think are also really interesting. When you use the word smart contract, it often like invokes the notion of law, which is closer to sort of some of today's thinking or today's problems. But I think that the beauty of the Bitcoin as a project is its scope. It's a contained thing. Its definition of trust is centered around digital scarcity, and that digital scarcity is applied to creating a ledger, and it's clean, it's straightforward, it has what it can do and what it can't do, and that's kind of that. And my concern is that the aura that has, the specter that has invoked, people showing up on Twitter saying that Bitcoin can solve problems of racial tension, is somewhere in there the dish ran away with the spoon. I'll stop there.
I mean, I think it ran away from the beginning, to be honest. Like, I take the point of like, it is, in one sense, it was a system that set out to do a very specific thing like Bitcoin, but you point correctly to like how quickly smart contracts developed as a way to think about, I guess, like ledger and blockchain technology, which is like then being like, oh, but if we write a contract and put it on a blockchain, it can be applied to everything. Like that explosion happened immediately. And also if you look at, and it was great that you suggested this, Brendan, like even the intro of the Bitcoin paper, it's like, it wants nothing less than to replace the entire financial system. Like, you know, like it was always grandiose, you know, or it was always like escaping at the seams of like a narrow scope. Like, I think it's just quite interesting because, or I mean, I think it poses a question to me because you know, it's a set of different underlying ideological assumptions that I'm comfortable with, right? I would say they're largely not liberatory. And so I'm like into like utopian dreaming and like imagining better futures and like building technologies that speculate on that. That's kind of what they did, but it's just that a lot of the like lineage of like where those things were coming from are not things that I down with, like, to be super frank, you know.
Yeah, mine too. Sorry, Don, you're kind of cutting up a little bit towards the end of there. Apologies. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, that's me. I'm sorry. It's my internet today. It's okay. Maybe that's someone else was already running. If you're able to mod.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think that I think you're right to sort of point to the opening paragraph of the Bitcoin paper. I want to ask the group. It's to me, I think that the cryptographic definition of trust implicitly seems to direct us to believe that like economics can save us. There's some notion of like of using money to solve our problems, and if we can just engineer digital money, if we can wrest control of money from classic old school structures like governments and Facebook, then we'll be able to like move forward and design better futures for ourselves. That's my read of the like crypto space a little bit. And I feel like we're really in like a, I don't know how well that argument holds up in the context of billions of people at home very angry about their relationship to certain governing structures. Does anybody want to take the bait on that?
I mean, I put abolish money in the chat, and you know, it's not something I ardently believe, but we have talked again and again in these discussions about the corrupting power of finance as it enters a system. And it's not even necessarily money itself, right? Like, it's not even necessarily the power that it, I guess, both is and represents. It tends to be like the conflation of something intangible for something tangible. And I think that that's where we get hung up with the technology as well.
Totally. The notion of digital scarcity for me is like a really interesting, and how that creates a tangibility, a fungibility, is a really interesting notion, right? At the same time, I think that like a project that would be interesting to bring up here as something of a counterpoint is like the Crypto Harlem project that here in New York, which is sort of really focused on fence-like communities sort of leveraging digital currencies and cryptography and techniques to both evade the surveillance state and to sort of like empower themselves to sort of catch the next wave of economic prosper. And so maybe this is like a double-edged sword. Maybe you can sort of engage with it for your own good, but I don't know. I don't know how. I just want to put that on the table because I'm not sure. I don't know. It's really hard to think about things these days in context of what's going on outside our windows and in the streets. Don, you had a point? Oh yeah, you're.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't make my internet less terrible. I'm gonna drop video. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, I was just saying in chat, I think there are these examples of people actually like subverting kind of like almost the, I hate to use this word, affordances of these technologies. We can park that conversation to later, till never. I think you mentioned one or a group, Brendan, I think like the Bail Block Fund, where people use crypto miners in the browser. I forget the name of that. Is it, it wasn't, I'm sorry, I forget the name of the underlying publication. It was like a progressive publication. They built this crypto miner that helped raise funds to pay for people's bail if you like visited their website in the browser and like allow them to use it. I also mentioned the Black Socialists of America have this decentralized organizing app that's called a Dual Power. It like also builds on the concept of dual power, sort of thinking about building alternative cooperative economies, and this idea of like how you can use these technologies in ways that like kind of subvert the premise of like markets and money as the site for change or something. Yeah, I think those are all really interesting as like kind of cool examples, but I don't know if they like they're like interventions in a space, but they might not like rework trust. I shouldn't say that. I think maybe something like Bail Block is more like an intervention. I think some of the other ones that you mentioned, and I think the Dual Power app maybe is really trying to fundamentally rework trust through how it uses those technologies. And then I'm interested in like how they're seeking to accomplish it, and like wondering what they have to, you know, like what they're going to change to get there, because it can't just be like an off-the-shelf way of using these things.
The bail concept is, there's so much about it, but the really hard to get around one is that you're literally giving money to the state that you don't think should be imprisoning people.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think we should have a topic. Oh shoot, Kevin, I'm sorry. I'll just say this. Next, who's with me next semester? Abolition.
Down.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of just add to the money question that Brendan brought up. And like, for me, like, and how it ties to trust is like, I feel like money is this thing that we've been taught that, you know, represents value and can be traded for resources. And it feels, and it's like, you know, you're born into the system that you didn't choose. So it feels like this system of coercion more than trust. Like, we like can exchange money not because we trust each other, but because like we've been like forced to do so. And so like how you're saying, like, yeah, like these systems that are just trying to not reform or revolutionize financial systems aren't enough, because like it doesn't take into account the things that Kelsey was mentioning, like at the protests where like people are giving hand sanitizer stuff for free. Like there's not this monetary transaction that's happening that's like slowly building trust. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, I deeply agree with you, Kevin. And I think some of you have heard me on this topic, but my chief concern with the design of some of these systems that co-opt the language of trust is, I think that it points back to what Mash, you were saying, of my personal definition of the word trust is something that is very open and free form. And while I completely want to sort of honor and respect, Don, the importance of protocol here, because I really think that's a massive piece, but I'm protocol not in the digital sense, in the human interaction sense, in the way of moving through the world sense. But setting that aside for a second, I think that like, Kevin, you're getting at the point that I care about the most, is that like trust for me comes from a system that feels like I have both agency and freedom to do whatever I want. And that for me personally really is one of the reasons I really gravitate toward barter economies, and why I think that like the central principle of open source is like such an important thing here, where like I don't have to do anything. I don't have to exchange value by any predetermined means. I can participate according to different skill sets. I can make contributions that are not necessarily fungible. And to me, that's a really important part of my definition of trust, and part of my definition of a framework in which a genuine definition of trust can emerge. And part of the reason that I was so infuriated by that TechCrunch article that sort of claimed that the next thing that was going to emerge was the trust web, and that it was going to be a collection of cryptocurrencies. Like, to me, that is just a total co-option of language that starts with the Bitcoin paper paragraph 1 and ends with people on Twitter claiming that money fixes everything and we should make it digital. Sorry, that's my rant.
That's good. I agree with you. I just wanted to throw that in there. And like, kind of like the idea of revolutionizing barter, I'm like really interested. I've been like reading about certain things like circular trades and how that solves the problem of, gosh, what's that? You know, that the need for like the people exchanging to want things from each other. And if you have like a circular trade, it like facilitates like larger, you know, possibilities of trade. And so look into that. I should find some stuff to share about it. But I'm curious about that type of stuff right now myself.
There's did we read this at a previous reading group? There's a great book, it's very accessible, called Taking Back the Economy by J.K. Gibson Graham. It's all about like actual concrete forms that are not the market as the sole way of thinking about economies, or like the free market in the sort of narrow capitalist sense. So like it talks about like local currencies, which are similar to like building circular economies through like bartering reform. It does mention like gift economies, and it kind of like has, I guess, a bit of like a transition approach in that it thinks it like identifies concrete steps that like maybe aren't totally all the way like are like also the ways you get there without requiring you to like justify that you're going to build a new system that's like coherently going to pop up and be fully formed like from this to that tomorrow, which I've been reading and listening to a lot more about abolition, obviously, like not obviously, but in light of everything that's happening. And there's a great podcast, Justice for America, with Mariama Kaba or Kabe. I actually don't remember her last name.
The Economist?
No, this is a prison abolitionist and organizer.
I'm totally thinking of the wrong person. My bad.
Yeah, she talks about this idea of like how you think about abolition. It's kind of like a process, like to go back to what Masha said, of like you ask yourself this question at each step, which is like, is this meaningfully dismantling the system or working towards dismantling the system? If so, then we do it. If it's something that could like make the system quote unquote more humane and like get us stuck in like a way that like actually perpetuates it, then we don't do it. And like that's how they like, a lot of people who are abolitionists like make arguments for or against certain types of reforms. Like, so some people, like some would maybe align with abolition, but other ones would not. Like, so that's why I think almost all people who are into abolition are like against body cams, because they're like, that's not going to do anything. That's actually like putting more money for specific things. It's like, no, like what you should do is like have police stop showing up at certain kinds of calls, like disarm them, cut their budgets, you know, like, because these will actually move in that direction, even if it's not like tomorrow there are 0 police. I'll try. Yeah, that is the, sorry, to the link that was posted in chat, that is the book.
And what was the podcast that you mentioned?
I'll dig it up too. It's called, it was Justice for America. It's like a prison abolition podcast. And this was just an excellent interview from last year. I'll post a link in chat. I mean, okay, so I think we have time, right? We have half an hour, a little less. You're so great at Googling, faster than me. That is the link. Yes, it's a great episode. And I wonder in that time if there's more that we want to take from any particular readings. I actually think kind of what we're continuing to return to is the paucity of the readings to explain like the kinds of ways we need to think about trust right now in relation to technology. So yeah, like what do we want to talk more about? Is there anything from those readings we need to say, or do we just want to scheme together for a better future with a different way we think about trust and technology?
I guess I'm curious about ideas of like constructive trust. Like we just had the abolition conversation briefly. It's a lot easier to oppose something than to build something good. And if it's not cryptographic economy, what is it?
I'm a big fan of that, and I'd like to ask the question of like using Masha's characteristic of vulnerability, or others could put in forth other phrases, but what systems actually can we think of that actually allow some degree of vulnerability? I found it very interesting, the like relationship between the protesters and the mayor of Minnesota, who was the recent interaction they had, where it was just like, are you going to abolish the police, yes or no? And then he was like, hesitation. And they were just like, shame, shame. And it was like, oh my God, this is Game of Thrones. Like, this is a very, like, while I very much agree with the end goal, it was like, and then you contrast that with the like 9 city council members who come forward with a much more cohesive plan and sort of present. I think there's a degree of vulnerability there, but I don't know, systems. I think that I'd love to just pivot to talking about everything non-cryptographic. Kelsey, I have no suggestion for you other than the hard work of people with concerns and people who are the subject of those concerns sitting at the same table. And I would submit that there are others far more equipped than me on the call to talk about processes that may sort of surround that, mediating that conversation.
Well, and I do think that it's interesting to bring back into that space of the current moment, because right now there's this really intense trust and really intense solidarity, and it's super multiracial and like super like from the protesters in the movement, and I've never felt anything quite like it. And the reason is people are bodily vulnerable, and people have needed to really use that bodily vulnerability. It's not like a fake thing at all. It's very real, and it's very, very real community solidarity, and very real like identifying problem elements surrounding them and having them exit the crowd, or helping somebody up off the ground who's been hit with a blast ball, or any of this stuff. Like, it's because of this extreme vulnerability, like that's the point of nonviolent direct action, right? Is because you're extremely vulnerable, you are suddenly much more trustworthy.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes me think of like mutually assured destruction, where, part of how like de-escalation happens is the possibility of harm to both sides, and it becomes incentivized to de-escalate because of that possibility of harm. And again, that kind of plays into the idea of like equity and power, and you can't really de-escalate if one side has all the power because they don't have any vulnerability. There was something else I wanted to bring up. I guess I'll think of it later.
Just to build on that, like, they abandoned the precinct and boarded it up, and they publicly stated it was a show of trust, because they were like, they're probably just going to burn it down, is like the obvious. And we were like, is this trust? Like, you abandoned a building assuming we would burn it? That doesn't feel like trust.
I guess it's not like a cryptographic system, but I kind of like the way that Facebook thinks about trust. I mean, obviously there's many criticisms of Facebook out there, but I think like the way that it conceptualizes human relationships in terms of like rings of trust, because you can like designate people as close friends, or people who can even like verify your account, but then you can also like have lists of people that you trust. Like I personally, I shit post on Maine, but but I have like a list of people that really get my actual like random memes I post, but then I also have like more like family friends who I only post like appropriate stuff to. So I think like but the thing is the user has control over the rings of trust, and they can move individuals between rings at their own discretion. Maybe that's sort of a way to conceptualize trust from a technological perspective, because like the technology facilitates that, as opposed to like Twitter where you're kind of posting publicly. I mean, I think they're gradually are introducing a little bit more control, but like it's not this to the same degree.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would just add to that. There's kind of a way though, or that is like maybe an imperfect read on trust, because it's like if it's only one-sided as like how that relationship gets represented, you know. There's something about how that gets codified in social networks which is very interesting. I think I've brought this up before on calls, but I'll say it again. I think the way that SSB really tries to think about interdependence, or like a way of thinking about how things are related to each other in a way that's like not one-sided, offers something. Also, I mean, honestly, I think we could design much less operationalized technology. Like things could be so much more speculative, is my firm belief, or experimental in these ways. But where I think we're kind of stuck in a very narrow way of developing things.
Is that a characteristic
There was
that's
a question or a thought. No, go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, I just think that that's a really interesting point. This emphasis on experimentation and what was the phrase you used on speculation? No, what was it?
You said speculative.
Yes, speculative. Like this lack of canonical. They like this method of codependence, and I think that like the phrase disintermediation really jumps out to me here, where like Scuttlebutt is like really a disintermediated platform, right? Like you don't have. You know, we'd often use the word centralization, but I think if you substitute that for disintermediation, like I think some of what we're seeing here is a technique, or is a situation whereby like we have a lot of people who are now disintermediated. Like we have people in the political system speaking directly to people to citizens. Okay, interesting example of disintermediation, but like you also have like the opposite of that, which is just like this heightened amount of contact between police and protester, which is like, I don't think that there's any disintermediation happening there. But I think there's something really interesting about the capacity for failure or tolerance for failure, and the varying expectations of tolerance for failure that all come to the mix in a group setting that is like really important to highlight in these conversations, because I think when we talk about trust, like one of the hardest expressions of a form of trust is like, hey, trust me, we're going to abolish the police. We're going to like take a bold step forward, and really we're going to do this knowing that we don't know the answers. We absolutely do not like fully understand what's on the other side of this, but we know that it's not that like we know that what we personally believe that we believe that what's on this side is bad. And I just think that that's interesting, where SSB like sort of like on the technical side gives us a mechanism for saying, no, you don't have the complete record. There's no such thing as the complete record. The whole thing is predicated on like, you know, whatever. Your network is who you see and who you interact with. And like, who cares what every transaction ever is? And why are we so concerned with like this sort of like digital consistency or consistency or consensus? I think that's like creates a much more interesting space for failure states. And I think that it's interesting that like the users of SSB are so much more willing to take risks and not concerned about, you know, I don't know, whether tweets are delivered inside of 2 milliseconds, which I think is an interesting sort of like characteristic to look at here in the group settings. For me, it's really interesting to think about the scaling factors of this trust phrase. And I think to me, the tolerance of failure is a biggie.
I don't know if disintermediation is always a good thing, because sometimes if you have, like in the case where there's an imbalance of power and you have direct interactions with somebody, then the fact that it's a direct interaction, it's not mediated by anything, kind of means that the imbalance of power is kind of presented in the pure state. Whereas if you have something that's mediating the interaction, then it's a little bit more balanced. You know, it's kind of like how if protesters are interacting with police in the flesh, then they're very vulnerable, but they can yell at the police department on social media, and then everyone is, because it's a public thing, everyone can see what they're saying, and so everyone can understand, like, oh wow, the police department just posted some bullshit and everyone's calling it out on it. So I feel like maybe sometimes it's not a bad thing to have an intermediary.
Oh, whoa, I was thinking, funny, I think just because I'm preparing for an AGM for a cooperative, I was thinking in the other direction, like the ways when, like by design, you need to like, I guess, yeah, like you need, well, the principle that was in my mind is like no voting by proxies, one person, one vote, are like, it's like kind of baked in as like this way that you kind of help keep folks closer to each other, or like to help with governance, where it's like, well, everyone's gonna have one vote, no one's gonna have any proxies. That kind of closeness is like, I guess, of a closed community is actually like super, I think, important to like that's baked in one of their 7 principles. But I take the point. I mean, I think though you're flagging an intense power asymmetry, like between the state and people, individuals, and like, you know, folks who may be non-citizens in some cases.
I just wanted to add real fast, like thinking about that, the interaction between the protesters and the police, and like how there can't be any trust there. I think one aspect of it is the anonymity. Like the police are covering up their badges and their names, and they're just like this, like they're not really individuals anymore, you know? They're just like this blob of force. And besides those, just like the outright brutality is that like how can you like know them, you know, ever in that context? They're not creating like even an environment for trust because of that.
There's I mean, this is something that I don't know a lot about. I wonder if other folks on this call have some of this context. I listened to one interview with someone who wrote a book about kind of like the like history of policing, and like obviously its connection to slavery and the slave trade, but then also its connection to like its long connection to militarism and imperial, you know, I guess, actions abroad. But there was a specific piece of that story which was kind of like the way that like that kind of blue coat wall of silence, or however people refer to it, where like you don't narc on other cops, basically, like became a thing. I think maybe speaks to that, like how that is used tactically, what you pointed out, Kevin. Yeah, but I think there's another thing though about like who gets rendered visible, right? It's like they get to be like a uniform force or like a wall, but then they have all these technologies and tools that render and individualize each person they're facing. And so, you know, people who are protesting then bear that weight of being visible.
Yeah, that's what Kelsey just put in the chat. I agree.
So there is some pretty interesting crowd, like they're trying to have that asymmetry, but I'm not sure to what extent they actually do, because the Twitterverse is real good at identifying license plates immediately and like found out who the shooter was the other day before the cops did, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think that just reopens like the conditions of possibility. It's like beyond police realism. Like, we don't need these systems. This doesn't have to be this way. Like, they're spending all this money to convince us it's impossible for it to be otherwise, but it's not. We don't need that. Like, institutionalized violence.
Yeah.
There's also something really interesting in this concept, and like, I don't know if this is the conversation to have this in, but there's, I guess this comes from the same argument as folks who talk about nuclear power and nuclear waste and whether that could ever be safe. And like, you know, there exists ambient radiation in uranium ore that you don't mine. So if you set your limit for tolerance, like if you ignore that and just say it can only be 0 and not like below the ambient unmined, like you create an impossible situation. That's a long way of getting to my point, which is like, we, the public, are fallible, definitely, but our guardrail shouldn't be whether we're fallible. It should be whether we're better than the fallibility that is like already inherent in the system.
I want to kind of bring back what Kevin said about, and also what Kelsey said about anonymity. And like, I think part of what, I don't think trust is really possible. Well, I think there's some context where anonymity is very important, but I think that for the most part, we can't really have trust in an anonymous situation, because trust kind of depends on continuity of relationship. If you're, there are contexts where there is like a one-time trust, but I think like
sorry, I'm just on another.
Oh, okay. But like, I think like, even in terms of, I think like social experiments about altruism and things like that, where if it's a one-time interaction, you're less likely to be altruistic. But if you know that you are going to have to collaborate with that person again and again in the future, then you're kind of necessitated to act a little bit more pro-socially in order to kind of gain the possibility of trust later in the future. And the idea of, I think also something we talked about a little bit, maybe like sort of in the middle of the discussion, was about the monetization aspect and how it kind of facilitates a quid pro quo or tit for tat mentality. Whereas I think trust, there's an element of ephemerality in it and an element of eternal aspect of it, because like if I'm building a trusting relationship with somebody, I guess like a lot of people do conceptualize it as like there has to be a balance in terms of give and take, but there's also an element of the trust itself being valuable and not just the individual transactions that are happening. And so I think in an anonymous context, you don't have that to facilitate it. And so like, and again, bringing back the police thing, like the anonymity has to be symmetrical in order to have trust, or it has to be completely no anonymity, because yeah, I agree. They shouldn't be hiding themselves.
And then the other thing, what you're saying is like, yeah, I don't keep a ledger of my like how I spend time and like help my friends and stuff like that. You know, like they bought me a meal this one time, I owe them a meal another time. You know, we don't do that. So like that idea of transactions and ledger, like does not factor in like how I like build relationships and trust with like my family and my friends. For sure, I agree with you.
That by David Graeber is so good on this. Oh, go ahead, Don.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to say, like, the concept of money that, so if you haven't read Debt, the First 1,000 Years by David Graeber, I super recommend it. But he talks a lot about the origins of money as, like, what's important is not the money, but actually the debt, and the importance of, like, you build a community by not ever canceling the debt, right? So like if you always owe each other something, you know that the relationship must continue. So there exist cultures even now where if you fully pay off a debt, that's a huge insult because it means that you may now part ways forever.
Sort of like how your social, not your credit score goes down if you pay off a loan.
I was gonna say, actually, this is like one part that I found really helpful about the Wikipedia like take on like the different domains that use trust. Is it sort of spoke about how in most social contexts, trust is kind of more used like a heuristic, like it's a way that, or it's like a stochastic, it's like a type of process that allows for like a quick register of like how you act in a situation, but it's not codified so like granularly, like as you all mentioned, down to the transaction level, which got like I think there's something to that I wanted to reflect on more. But also when you were talking about anonymity and trust, I'm sorry, voting on my mind this AGM is like a lot of work. But I was thinking about the alternative, which is not anonymity but secret, and how that relates to trust as being very valuable. So say like thinking about voting mechanisms, like open ballots and open balloting is one, but in many cases, you always also have provisions for when you do secret ballots. And that is a part of a way that you maintain like community cohesion and like trust. And like if you think about democratic participation, that's actually a way to build trust in a democratic process in like a larger scales, is if people know that they can express their opinions without folks looking over their shoulders as they do it. Anyway, so I don't know exactly how to unpack secret now, and we don't have time, but I think there's something really cool there, and how that relates to building trust, but that is quite distinct from like anonymity.
I think it kind of made me think of like, if you're buying federal bonds, treasury bonds or whatever, like there's sort of, I guess that's commonly accepted that they will eventually be paid off no matter what. It's like the most secure bond or whatever. And I think part of that kind of echoes that idea of like a future expectation that's always in the future, which creates trust. Because like it kind of forms a sort of economic backbone in a certain way. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but kind of.
I just want to point out that we're almost at time. And I feel like this has been a really wonderful conversation and we went in some really cool directions, but I also kind of am cognizant that it's okay to not keep ourselves on this call for very long, longer than we were planning to, unless there's like a really strong reason that people want to continue. So maybe I'll just ask if people have like some final thoughts or things they want to flag or future topics that we want to read about. But also I just want to say, like, I appreciate that we brought everything that was ourselves to this call and it wasn't about cryptographic trust, and that was okay.
That's great. Yeah, I really enjoy this conversation. I think one thing I'm really curious about, because Kelsey has been like, involved in the protest so much, and I really want to hear from her sometime later, but like how is she building trust with like folks that she's meeting on the ground, you know, over time now. I'd be really interested to hear about that. That's all.
Yeah, I want to know too. I have no idea. I got to give out eye washes the other day, and it was just like, oh, this cat opens doors. Yeah, but everybody's
privacy.
trusting. Yeah, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say, privacy is our next topic. I think abolition is a topic that should come up soon, and maybe we could stop recording. And